Is the Sony a6000 still worth buying in 2021? In this video, we'll find out. There isn't much to be said about this camera that hasn't been said 1,000 times before, and its everlasting popularity is testament to what a great camera it has been. But does it still hold up to 2021 standards? Let's have a quick look at the specs of the Sony a6000. The Sony a6000 is a mirrorless camera with an APS-C size 24.3 megapixel sensor. It has an ISO range of 100 to 25,600. It has 179 autofocus points, 11 frames per second burst shooting, and can record video at 1080p at 60 frames per second. So in comparison to a lot of newer cameras, some of these specs are definitely starting to look a little out of date. Newer Sony cameras boast better autofocus systems and can record 4K video, sometimes up to 120 frames per second. So the reasons to pick up the Sony a6000 are getting fewer and fewer every year. But that isn't to say there aren't a lot of positives to this camera, and we'll go through those now. But before we get started, I make lots of tips and tricks videos for Sony mirrorless cameras. So if that sounds like your sort of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on the video. So the first plus point of the Sony a6000 is that sensor, that 24.3 megapixel sensor, which is still very comparable to newer cameras which still use sensors around the same size. I think it even is the exact same sensor in a lot of new cameras. So the sensor itself is not the problem with this camera. And the resolution is definitely big enough that if you wanted to blow up your prints to put on the wall, you'd easily be able to do that and they wouldn't look out of place. There'd be plenty of detail there. So that is a huge positive for what is a 7-year-old camera, that the sensor still is really good enough. The second plus point is that this camera uses the trusty E-mount lens system. Now this sounds like an obvious thing, but it really is a huge selling point. Maybe when this camera first came out in 2014, there wasn't that many E-mount lenses out there for this camera, so it wasn't that much of a selling point. But as it's gained in popularity and this E-mount lens system is used on all the Sony cameras now, there are just loads and loads of lenses out there, whether that's Sony first-party lenses or lenses made by third-party manufacturers. There are lots of options out there. Whether you want a prime or a zoom lens or a telephoto or a macro lens, there are loads of lenses in every category at all types of price points, which means that it's just a really adaptable camera which you can take all the way from being an absolute beginner and, well, maybe not up to being a pro, but being able to take very good quality photos. And I think most people would think they come from a more expensive camera, and that is just down to how great the E-mount lens range is. And that is worth bearing in mind that when you upgrade your camera, if you ever do, that you'll be able to port all your lenses over to other Sony E-mount lens system cameras. Another great plus point. It also has that maximum ISO of 25,600, which is great for adding a bit of extra light to your photos, especially if you are shooting in dark situations. Now, of course, that does add a little bit of grain, but this is a big plus over things like smartphone cameras, which just have pretty poor low light performance, even if they say that they don't. So that is a good plus point, especially if you can pick up an a6000 relatively cheap. And another huge plus point for me is that 11 frames per second burst shooting. There are a lot of newer cameras that still don't shoot in quite so many frames per second, and being able to shoot that quickly is great for stuff like sports or wildlife photography, where your subject is going to be moving really quickly and you want to be able to capture that exact shot in the middle of something moving, where you want to know that you're going to capture exactly what you're aiming for, which isn't always an option with a lot of cameras. I use the 11 frames per second burst shooting a lot, and it is a big plus point for the a6000. And the autofocus system on this camera is still fairly decent. There's 179 autofocus points, and I find that this autofocus is fairly smooth and fairly quick. You can move in and out, move things in front of the lens, and the camera will focus pretty quickly. Now, obviously, compared to much newer cameras such as the Sony a6600, which I think has 425 autofocus points, it isn't going to be as snap quick and as smooth as it is on the much newer cameras, but to be honest, for most situations, I still find the autofocus system on the a6000 is more than good enough. So that is a pretty decent list of plus points for what is a 7-year-old camera. But now let's have a look at some of the downsides. Obviously, as this camera is 7 years old, it isn't going to be keeping up with the latest and greatest in camera technology, and the lack of 4K video support is a big sign of this. Now, I've usually mentioned that 4K video just isn't usually that important, especially for stuff like YouTube. I think most people still are watching in 1080p. But as the years roll on, 4K is becoming more and more standard. And that means that video makers, filmmakers, whatever you're using the A6000 for, are going to start wanting that highest quality possible. And at a maximum of 1080p, this camera is starting to be left behind a bit. So if you're thinking of buying the A6000, this is something you're going to have to consider. Whilst 1080p is definitely good enough for most situations now, this camera isn't future-proof from that point of view. Staying on the video theme, this camera maxes out at 60 frames per second, which means that it really isn't good enough for decent slow motion footage. Now, okay, that's maybe a bit of a niche case. Most of the time, you're probably not going to want to be recording in 60 frames per second anyway if you're doing YouTube videos and stuff like that. It isn't necessary, but if you want that highest quality video, especially if you're doing kind of B-roll footage, slow motion is a pretty desirable effect to be able to get from a camera. And 60 frames per second can do it a little bit, but compared to the newer cameras being able to do up to 120 frames per second on the newer Sony cameras, it is starting to be left behind a little bit in that regard. And let's talk about some of the physical features of this camera, such as the 3-inch screen. Now, it's a decent sized screen, but its lack of full articulation, it doesn't flip up to 180 degrees, means that it's not really a great camera for vlogging, or even if you just need to monitor it yourself or your subject while recording. You're going to need an external monitor to be able to see in front of the camera, if you know what I mean. So that is a bit of a downside, because even some of the older cameras from around that time, such as the A5100, did have the fully flip up screen. So definitely worth bearing in mind when looking at buying this camera. Other problems with the screen is that it has no touch controls at all, so you can't navigate the menus with this screen, or you can't touch the focus either. These features are definitely frustrating because that sort of thing is starting to feel quite standard now, and that lacking just does slow down your workflow a little bit. Another downside is that there is no audio jack for plugging in a microphone to this camera. That means that you're going to need to be using either the onboard microphones or an external audio device to record audio. Now, there is the hot shoe on the top as well, which you can attach a specialist microphone to, but the options in that are quite limited compared to what you can get on a 3.5mm microphone of basically whatever you choose. And the onboard audio is okay, but I find it's quite echoey and just probably not quite the standard that you want. So I think overall these downsides are quite understandable, especially for a camera this age. And this is where I would normally say we can deal with the downsides because the price of this camera is so cheap that it makes it a brilliant beginner's camera. Unfortunately, more recently, as of now, which is March 2021, the price of the A6000 is higher than it's been for quite a few years. Currently, if you want to pick up this camera new, you're looking at around $650, and even on the second-hand market, it's going for as much as $400, $450. Which is alarmingly high, I would say, for a 7-year-old camera. Even just a year ago when I was filming a similar video, we were looking at brand new prices of $450 and second-hand prices of around $300, which is much more manageable for an entry-level camera. But unfortunately, because people are working from home more and they want to improve their quality of video recording for Zoom calls or meetings for work and stuff like that, people are upgrading from standard webcams to cheap mirrorless cameras, which this is, which has basically completely torn out the bottom of the market and just boosted up the prices. I don't know if it's just a supply and demand thing, or people are just noticing that people are wanting these cameras more and jacking up the prices. But it's really unfortunate because this camera and the A5100 especially, I always recommended as really cheap entry-level ways into photography and videography that wasn't going to break the bank and you could really get into it really cheaply. And that just isn't the case anymore. So from that point of view, right now, I'm not going to recommend picking up the Sony a6000 in 2021. Whilst the features are still good enough for most situations, I still use mine all the time for recording videos like this. The 1080p doesn't bother me too much and stuff like that. It is a fine camera. So if you already have one, I'm not saying you definitely need to upgrade straight away. It's not good enough. But unfortunately, just being able to pick up one new in 2021, unless the price goes down, so I'd definitely keep an eye on it, because if the prices go back down to, what I was saying, $300 secondhand or $400 new, something like that, then yes, I would recommend picking it up again. But right now, at the prices at this higher price point, I would just keep an eye on the prices and just see if they drop down, or maybe look for an alternative camera, which might be a little bit cheaper, but still offers pretty similar features. So, are you still using the Sony a6000 in 2021? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on it. Also, if you want to check out any of my photography, you can find it on Instagram at aaron.prescott. But that's it from me for now. Until next time, see ya.